The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Blackmore Manor with such ferocity that Lady Eleanor Ashford could barely hear her own thoughts. Perhaps that was a mercy. In 2 days' time, she would become the wife of Viscount Thornfield, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of decay. The servants whispered about his brutality, about the young women who disappeared into his estate never to be seen again, about debts paid in flesh and blood. Eleanor's father, however, heard only the clink of gold coins and the promise of political favour. She stood before the mirror in her chamber, watching as her lady's maid, Margaret, fastened the buttons of her mourning dress. It seemed fitting somehow, wearing black on the eve of her wedding preparations. She was mourning herself, the life she would never live, the choices that had been stripped from her before she could even understand what choice meant. "My lady, you're trembling," Margaret said softly, her weathered hands steadying as they worked. The old woman had served the Ashford family for 3 decades, had witnessed Eleanor's birth, had taught her to read when her father deemed it unnecessary for a woman. Now she was bearing witness to Eleanor's sacrifice. The cold, Eleanor lied, though the fire roared in the hearth and the room was stifling. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, from the place where fear and fury tangled together like thorns in her chest. She had tried everything. She had begged her father, appealed to her mother, even attempted to convince her brother to intercede. But Lord Ashford's gambling debts were mountainous, and Viscount Thornfield had offered a solution wrapped in the guise of a marriage proposal. Eleanor was simply the currency her father needed to save himself from ruin. Outside her window, beyond the rain-soaked grounds, she could see the lights of the village flickering in the distance. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, making ordinary choices. She envied them with an intensity that surprised her. A farmer's wife could at least choose her tasks for the day, could walk to market without permission, could speak her mind in the privacy of her home. Eleanor would have none of these freedoms. She would be a possession, a trinket displayed at Thornfield's gatherings, a vessel for heirs she didn't want to bear. Margaret finished with the buttons and stepped back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "There now, my lady. You look as beautiful as always." Beautiful. The word felt like an insult. Her beauty was the very thing that had doomed her. Thornfield had seen her at a ball in London 3 months ago and decided he wanted her. Not loved her, not courted her, simply wanted her the way one might want a rare painting or an exotic horse. Her father had been summoned the very next day, and the negotiations had begun without Eleanor's knowledge. By the time she learned of the arrangement, contracts had been signed, announcements had been made, and her fate had been sealed with red wax and her father's desperate signature. A knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. Margaret moved to answer it, and Eleanor's younger brother Thomas entered the room. At 17, he still carried the softness of youth in his features, though his eyes had hardened considerably since their father's betrayal had become clear. He had argued against the marriage more vehemently than anyone, had even threatened to challenge Thornfield to a duel before their mother had locked him in his quarters for 3 days to prevent such foolishness. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, "I need to speak with you, alone." Margaret glanced at Eleanor, who nodded. The maid curtsied and slipped from the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. Thomas crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grasped Eleanor's hands. His palms were sweating despite the autumn chill. "You cannot marry him. I won't allow it." "You have no more power to prevent it than I do," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. She had exhausted her tears days ago and now existed in a strange state of numb acceptance. "Father has made his choice." "Then we'll run. Tonight. I've been saving my allowance and I have contacts in Scotland. We could disappear, start new lives where no one knows the Ashford name." The offer was tempting, achingly so, but Eleanor knew the consequences. If she fled, her father's debts would remain unpaid, and Thornfield's fury would know no bounds. The Viscount was not a man who accepted defiance. He would hunt them down, and when he found them, the punishment would be worse than anything she currently faced. More than that, her absence would destroy what remained of her family. Her mother would be cast out of society, her brother's prospects would evaporate, and her younger sisters would never find suitable matches. Eleanor's sacrifice was meant to save them all. "I cannot be so selfish," she whispered, pulling her hands free from his grip. "If I run, the entire family pays the price." Better that than watching you march to your death, Thomas said harshly. Because that's what this is, Eleanor. He will destroy you piece by piece until there's nothing left of the sister I love. Before Eleanor could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This one was sharper, more insistent. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed and her breathing rapid. In her hands she clutched a letter, the envelope made of cream-colored paper so fine it was almost translucent. A red wax seal adorned the back. Impressed with a coat of arms, Eleanor recognized immediately. A lion rampant beneath a crown, the seal of the Duke of Ravencross. "This just arrived by special courier, my lady," Margaret said, pressing the letter into Eleanor's hands. "The messenger said it was urgent, for your eyes only." Eleanor stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. The Duke of Ravencross was one of the most powerful men in England, a war hero who had returned from the continent with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and unwavering honor. He moved in circles far above the Ashfords, and Eleanor had never even been introduced to him. Why would he be writing to her now on the eve of her wedding? Thomas leaned closer, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was strong and precise, each letter formed with the confidence of a man who knew his words carried weight. "Lady Eleanor, forgive the intrusion and the shocking nature of this correspondence. We have never been formally introduced, yet circumstances compel me to write to you with information that may alter the course of your immediate future. I have recently returned from Italy, where I encountered a man claiming to be Viscount Thornfield's elder brother, presumed dead these 15 years. He lives there under an assumed name, having fled England to escape his younger brother's murderous intentions. He possesses documents proving his identity and his rightful claim to the Thornfield title and estates. If his claims are legitimate, the man you are set to marry is not the true Viscount Thornfield and has no legal right to the title, lands or fortune he currently enjoys. This would render any marriage contract based on his current status null and void. I have taken the liberty of investigating these claims and believe them to be genuine. However, time is of the essence. If you wish to contest your marriage before it takes place, I can provide the evidence and support necessary to do so. I am prepared to present this information to the proper authorities, but I will not do so without your consent, as it may cause scandal for your family. I realize this letter asks you to trust a stranger with matters of the gravest importance. I can only offer my word as a gentleman and as a man who has seen too many innocents destroyed by those who abuse power. You deserve a choice in your own future, Lady Eleanor. This letter is my attempt to give you one. If you wish to proceed, burn this letter and attend your wedding as planned. If you wish to fight, send word to my London residence before tomorrow's sunset. I will do the rest. Your servant, Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Ravencross. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each word searing itself into her memory. Thomas read over her shoulder, his breath catching with each revelation. When she finally lowered the paper, her hands were shaking so violently that the letter fluttered like a captive bird. "This is impossible," she breathed. "Why would the Duke involve himself in my affairs? How would he even know about my situation?" "Does it matter?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising with excitement. "Eleanor, this is your chance. If Thornfield isn't really Thornfield, then the marriage contract is worthless. Father would have no grounds to force you into it." "Or it could be a trick," Eleanor said, her mind racing through possibilities. "Thornfield has enemies. Someone could be using me to get to him, and I would be caught in the crossfire." "The Duke of Ravencross is not known for playing games," Thomas argued. "His reputation is impeccable. If he says he has evidence, then he has evidence." Eleanor walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and through the fog she could see the torches of Thornfield's men patrolling the grounds. He had insisted on providing security for the wedding, but Eleanor knew it was really about control. He was making sure she didn't escape, that she remained his prize until the moment she became his property. "If I pursue this, and it fails, Thornfield will make me suffer for it," she said quietly. "His revenge would be terrible, and if you don't pursue it, you'll suffer anyway," Thomas countered. "At least this way you have a chance." Margaret had remained silent during the exchange, but now she stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "My lady, I've served this family long enough to recognize an opportunity when I see one. The Duke is offering you a way out. Whether you take it or not is your choice, but it is a choice. That alone is more than you had an hour ago." A choice. The word echoed in Eleanor's mind, foreign and powerful. For months she had been told that she had no choices, that her duty was to obey, to accept, to submit. Now a stranger was offering her something she thought she'd lost forever: agency. But with that choice came risk. If she sent word to the Duke and his evidence proved false or insufficient, she would have publicly humiliated Thornfield. The Viscount was not a forgiving man. He would find ways to make her regret her defiance, and those ways would be creative and cruel. Even if the Duke's claims were true, the scandal would taint her family's name. Society whispered about the Ashfords already, gossiped about their financial troubles and their desperate alliance with Thornfield. This would confirm every nasty rumor and add new fuel to the fire. On the other hand, marrying Thornfield was a certainty of suffering. She had heard the stories from too many sources to dismiss them as mere gossip. The servants who had worked at his estate and fled in the night. The young bride from 2 years ago who had died under mysterious circumstances. The gambling debts he paid by selling information to foreign powers. The man was poison, and she was being asked to drink deeply from his cup. "I need to think," Eleanor said, though her heart was already pulling her toward a decision. "Thomas, return to your room before Father notices you're gone. Margaret, please ensure we're not disturbed." Thomas hesitated, clearly wanting to argue further, but he recognized the set of Eleanor's jaw. He had seen that expression before, when she had made up her mind about something and would not be swayed. He squeezed her shoulder gently and left the room, Margaret following to keep watch in the hallway. Alone, Eleanor returned to the letter, reading it once more by the light of the fire. The Duke's handwriting revealed much about him, she thought. There was precision in every stroke, confidence in every word. This was not a man who acted impulsively or made empty promises. If he said he had evidence, then he believed it to be true. If he offered his support, then he intended to provide it. But why? That was the question that nagged at her. The Duke of Ravencross was wealthy beyond measure, powerful beyond question, and connected to the highest circles of society. He had no reason to care about the fate of one insignificant young woman trapped in a bad marriage, unless there was something else at play, some motivation she couldn't see. Eleanor thought back to what she knew about the Duke, which was admittedly little. He had gone to war at 20, distinguished himself in battle, and returned home covered in glory and scars. He had inherited his title at a young age after his father's sudden death, and had managed the duchy with remarkable skill. There were rumors, of course, whispers that he had lost someone dear to him during the war, that he had returned changed, haunted by things he had seen and done. Some said he was cold and calculating, others that he was fiercely protective of the innocent. Both could be true, she supposed. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney, and Eleanor made her decision. She walked to her writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. Her hand hovered over the inkwell for just a moment before she dipped her quill and began to write. "Your Grace, I accept your offer of assistance and place my trust in your word as a gentleman. Please proceed with presenting your evidence to the proper authorities. Whatever scandal may result, I would rather face it with honor than marry without it. I am prepared for the consequences and ask only that you act swiftly, as time is not on our side. With deepest gratitude, Eleanor Ashford." She sealed the letter with her personal seal, a simple flower that suddenly seemed inadequate for such momentous correspondence. Then she rang for Margaret and handed her the envelope along with careful instructions. The letter was to be delivered to the Duke's London residence before dawn, carried by a courier they could trust to be discreet. As Margaret left to arrange the delivery, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was close. For the first time in months she had taken action rather than simply enduring. She had chosen her own path, even if that path led to ruin. There was power in that choice, a kind of freedom she hadn't expected to feel. The night stretched ahead of her, long and uncertain. Sleep was impossible. Instead, Eleanor sat by the window and watched the rain fall, each drop a tiny rebellion against the earth below. By morning her letter would reach the Duke. By afternoon the wheels would be in motion, and by evening her entire world might be transformed. She thought of Thornfield receiving the news, his face contorting with rage as he learned that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. She thought of her father's reaction, the panic and blame that would surely follow. She thought of society's whispers growing into shouts, the scandal spreading like wildfire through ballrooms and parlors. But mostly, she thought of the possibility that she might be free. The Duke had called himself her servant in the letter, a curious phrase from a man of his station. She wondered what he looked like, this mysterious benefactor who had appeared in her darkest hour. Was he old or young, kind or stern, handsome or plain? It seemed foolish to wonder about such things when her entire future hung in the balance, yet she couldn't help herself. He had given her a gift more precious than gold, the chance to fight for herself. As dawn approached, turning the sky from black to grey to pale gold, Eleanor remained at her window. She had not changed from her morning dress, had not lain down to rest. She was waiting, though for what exactly she couldn't say, a sign perhaps, or simply the courage to face what came next. When Margaret finally returned as the sun broke over the horizon, her face was flushed from the cold morning air. "It's done, my lady. The courier rode out an hour ago. He'll reach London by midday." "Thank you, Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "Whatever happens now, I want you to know that I'm grateful for your loyalty." The old woman's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back and curtsied. "It's been my honor to serve you, Lady Eleanor. Your mother would be proud of your courage." The mention of her mother, who had passed 5 years ago, sent a pang through Eleanor's heart. Her mother had been gentle and kind, had tried to shield her children from their father's worst impulses. She had died without knowing that her daughter would one day be sold to a monster. Perhaps that was a blessing. The house began to stir as servants went about their morning tasks. Eleanor could hear her father's voice booming from downstairs, already in a foul mood despite the early hour. He was no doubt reviewing the wedding arrangements, making sure every detail was perfect. The ceremony would take place in the local church, followed by a lavish breakfast at Blackmore Manor. After that, Eleanor would leave with Thornfield for his estate, and her old life would end. Except now there was a chance it wouldn't happen that way. The Duke had set something in motion, something that could change everything. Eleanor just had to wait and see if his evidence was strong enough to break the chains that bound her. The morning passed in a blur. Eleanor's younger sisters, Charlotte and Amelia, came to her room to chatter about the wedding. They were too young to understand the true nature of what was happening, saw only the romance of a grand ceremony and a handsome husband. Eleanor let them talk, grateful for their innocence, even as it pained her. Charlotte was only 15, Amelia 13. In a few years they too would face the marriage market, would learn that their dreams and desires meant nothing compared to their value as commodities. Unless Eleanor could change that. If she could break free from Thornfield, if she could prove that women had the right to choose their own futures, perhaps her sisters would have a better chance. Perhaps they could marry for love instead of obligation, could pursue their own interests instead of being forced into molds they didn't fit. It was a wild hope, perhaps even a foolish one, but it sustained her through the endless hours. By afternoon, the entire household was in an uproar. Wedding gifts had begun arriving, elaborate displays of silver and crystal that seemed to mock Eleanor's situation. Thornfield himself had sent a diamond necklace, heavy and ostentatious, designed more to display his wealth than to suit her taste. Eleanor left it in its velvet box, unable to bring herself to even touch it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Eleanor heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the manor. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it news from the Duke, or perhaps Thornfield himself, arriving early for some nefarious purpose? She rushed to the window and saw a single rider approaching, dressed in the livery of the Duke of Ravencross. The man dismounted and was quickly shown inside by the butler. Minutes stretched like hours as Eleanor waited, her hands gripping the window-sill so tightly her knuckles turned white. Finally, Margaret appeared at her door, her face unreadable. "My lady, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent." Eleanor followed Margaret downstairs to one of the smaller receiving rooms, away from the main areas where her father might overhear. The man waiting for her was tall and imposing, with steel-grey hair and a military bearing. He bowed formally as she entered. "Lady Eleanor, I am James Whitmore, Secretary to the Duke of Ravencross. His Grace has asked me to deliver this message personally and to await your response." He handed her a sealed envelope, this one marked with the Duke's seal in black wax. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke it open and read, "Lady Eleanor, the wheels are in motion. I have presented the evidence to the Lord Chancellor, and he has agreed to examine the claims immediately. A formal inquiry will be announced tomorrow morning, which will automatically delay your wedding until the matter is resolved. I must warn you that Viscount Thornfield will not take this news well. I am sending men to guard Blackmore Manor tonight and tomorrow. Do not leave the house for any reason, and do not meet with Thornfield if he arrives. Your safety is paramount. I will call on you tomorrow afternoon to discuss the next steps. Until then, trust that you are not alone in this fight. St." Eleanor looked up at Whitmore, her mind reeling. "It's really happening? The wedding will be delayed?" "Yes, my lady. The official announcement will be made at first light. His Grace wanted you to be prepared for your father's reaction and for any attempts by Thornfield to take matters into his own hands." "Why is the Duke doing this?" Eleanor asked, the question finally bursting free. "He doesn't know me. He has no obligation to help me." Whitmore's stern expression softened slightly. "His Grace believes that power should be used to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He has seen too much cruelty in his lifetime and has vowed to stand against it when he can. Your situation came to his attention through mutual acquaintances, and he felt compelled to act. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was enough for now." Eleanor nodded, accepting the Duke's mysterious motivations as a gift she didn't fully understand. "Please tell His Grace that I am grateful beyond words." "I will, my lady. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must speak with your butler about the security arrangements. The Duke's men will be stationed around the property by nightfall." As Whitmore left to make his arrangements, Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. It was real. The Duke had acted swiftly and decisively, had used his influence to buy her time and protection. Tomorrow morning, when the announcement was made, all hell would break loose. Her father would be apoplectic, Thornfield would be dangerous, and society would explode with gossip. But she would be safe, at least for now, and that was more than she had dared to hope for. That evening, as predicted, chaos descended on Blackmore Manor. Lord Ashford received word of the inquiry through his own channels, and his roar of fury could be heard throughout the house. He stormed into Eleanor's room without knocking, his face purple with rage. "What have you done?" he bellowed, advancing on her like a bull. "How dare you interfere with arrangements I have made? Do you have any idea what this will cost us?" Eleanor stood her ground, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I have done nothing but seek the truth, Father. If Thornfield is not who he claims to be, then surely you want to know that before binding our family to him." "The Duke of Ravencross," her father spat the name like a curse. "That meddling fool has no right to interfere in private family matters. I'll see him ruined for this." "You'll do nothing of the sort," Thomas said, appearing in the doorway. Behind him, Eleanor could see several large men in the Duke's livery, clearly prepared to intervene if Lord Ashford became violent. "The Duke is well within his rights to bring evidence of fraud to the authorities. If you threaten him, you'll be the one who faces consequences." Lord Ashford turned his rage on his son, but the presence of the guards seemed to check his temper. He settled for a venomous glare instead. "You'll both regret this. When the inquiry proves that Thornfield's title is legitimate, he'll make sure you pay for this insult. And I'll do nothing to stop him." He stormed from the room, slamming the door so hard the paintings rattled on the walls. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't known she was holding and sank onto her bed. Thomas crossed to her side and took her hand. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." "I haven't done anything yet," Eleanor corrected. "The inquiry could fail. The evidence could be insufficient. Thornfield could be exactly who he says he is." "But you fought back," Thomas insisted. "That's what matters. Whatever happens now, you made a choice." Through the window, Eleanor could see the lights of the Duke's guards taking up positions around the manor. She felt like a princess in a tower, waiting for rescue but not entirely sure if the rescue would come. Somewhere in London, the Duke of Ravencross was preparing for tomorrow's confrontation. She wondered if he was nervous, if he doubted his evidence, if he regretted involving himself in her troubles. She hoped she would get the chance to thank him properly, to understand why a powerful duke had chosen to champion the cause of an insignificant young woman. But more than that, she hoped his evidence would prove true, that the man she was meant to marry was indeed a fraud, and that she might finally have a chance at a different future. As night fell and the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, Eleanor lay in her bed fully clothed, too anxious to sleep. Tomorrow would bring answers, for better or worse. The Duke had given her a chance to fight for herself, and she had taken it. Now she could only wait and see if that fight would lead to freedom, or to an even darker fate than the one she had been trying to escape. The rain began again, drumming against the windows like 1,000 urgent fingers. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to its rhythm, finding comfort in its constancy. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with her head held high. She had chosen courage over submission, risk over certainty, hope over despair. The Duke of Ravencross had offered her a choice, and she had seized it with both hands. Now she just had to survive long enough to see where that choice would lead. The morning broke grey and cold, a fitting backdrop for the storm that was about to engulf Blackmore Manor. Eleanor had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep before dawn pulled her back to consciousness. She dressed carefully in a simple gown of deep blue, rejecting the elaborate white wedding dress that hung in her wardrobe like a ghost. If today was to be a battle, she would not go into it dressed as a bride. Margaret helped her with her hair, pulling it back in a severe style that made Eleanor look older, more formidable. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The frightened girl who had accepted her fate had been replaced by someone harder, someone who had learned that survival sometimes required defiance. The announcement came at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. A royal messenger arrived at both Blackmore Manor and Thornfields Estate simultaneously, delivering official notice that an inquiry into the legitimacy of the Thornfield title had been opened by order of the Lord Chancellor. All parties involved were summoned to appear before a special tribunal in 3 days' time. Until the matter was resolved, any marriage contracts contingent upon the Thornfield title and estates were to be considered suspended. Eleanor was in the breakfast room when the announcement was made, picking at toast she couldn't taste. Her father read the notice in silence, his face cycling through shades of red and purple before settling on a dangerous pale. He crumpled the paper in his fist and threw it into the fire. "This is your doing," he said, his voice low and deadly. "You have embarrassed this family beyond repair. No decent man will want you now, damaged goods tainted by scandal." "If no decent man wants me, then I will remain unmarried," Eleanor replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I would rather die alone than marry a man who sees me as property." Her father rose from his chair so violently it toppled backward. For a moment Eleanor thought he might strike her, but Thomas stepped between them, his young face set with determination. "Enough, father. The announcement has been made, and there's nothing any of us can do now but wait for the tribunal's decision. If Thornfield is legitimate, then the marriage can proceed. If he's not, then Eleanor's objections were justified." "Get out of my sight," Lord Ashford snarled, addressing them both. "Both of you, before I forget that you're my children." Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She fled the breakfast room with Thomas close behind, seeking refuge in the library where her father rarely ventured. Once the door was closed, she allowed herself to tremble, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her weak. "He'll come around," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction, "once the shock wears off." "No, he won't," Eleanor said. "I've humiliated him in front of society, cost him his solution to his debts, and aligned myself with a duke who has more power than he could ever dream of possessing. He'll never forgive me for that." They spent the morning in the library, both too anxious to focus on reading but grateful for the sanctuary. Outside they could hear servants running back and forth, visitors arriving to gossip about the scandal, and Eleanor's younger sisters being hurriedly ushered away from the drama. The whole household had been thrown into chaos by the announcement, and Eleanor knew she was to blame. Guilt gnawed at her. She hadn't considered how her actions would affect everyone else, had been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't thought about the ripples her defiance would create. Charlotte and Amelia would face whispers and judgment because of her. Her mother's memory would be tainted by the scandal. Even the servants would suffer, as the Ashford family's already precarious social position crumbled further. But what was the alternative? Should she have marched to the altar and sacrificed herself to preserve appearances? Would that have been the nobler choice? No. Eleanor squared her shoulders and pushed the guilt aside. She had a right to fight for herself, even if that fight was messy and uncomfortable for others. Women had been sacrificing themselves for the comfort of men since time immemorial. Perhaps it was time that pattern was broken. At noon, a carriage arrived bearing the Duke of Ravencross's coat of arms. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. He had said he would call in the afternoon, but perhaps circumstances had changed. She and Thomas rushed to the window and watched as a footman opened the carriage door. The man who emerged was not what Eleanor had expected. She had imagined the Duke as older, perhaps grey-haired and distinguished like his secretary. Instead, the man who strode up the manor's steps was young, perhaps 30 at most, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead and a face that bore the marks of someone who had seen too much too soon. He was tall and powerfully built, moving with the controlled grace of a soldier. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir of war that somehow enhanced rather than diminished his appearance. "That's the Duke of Ravencross?" Thomas breathed, clearly impressed. "I thought he'd be older." Eleanor couldn't respond. She was too busy trying to reconcile the man approaching her home with the compassionate words he had written in his letters. He looked formidable, even dangerous, not like someone who concerned himself with the plight of trapped young women. Yet here he was, arriving in broad daylight to face whatever consequences his actions had created. The butler announced the Duke's arrival, and Eleanor's father, despite his fury, could not refuse to receive such an important visitor. Eleanor and Thomas hurried to the formal drawing room, where they found Lord Ashford already waiting, his expression carefully controlled despite the anger that still simmered beneath. When the Duke entered, the room seemed to shrink around him. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. His eyes swept the space and landed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her catch her breath. They were grey, she noted, the colour of storm clouds, and they seemed to see far more than they should. "Lord Ashford," the Duke said, his voice deep and cultured, "thank you for receiving me." "Did I have a choice?" her father replied coldly. "You've inserted yourself into my family's private affairs and created a scandal that will take years to recover from." "I've brought evidence of fraud to the proper authorities, as is my duty as a peer of the realm," the Duke corrected. "If the man claiming to be Viscount Thornfield is legitimate, then the inquiry will confirm that, and the matter will be settled. If he is not, then you should thank me for saving your daughter from a marriage that would have been legally invalid." Lord Ashford's jaw worked, but he couldn't argue with that logic. Instead, he gestured sharply to Eleanor. "This is the daughter in question. I trust you're satisfied with the chaos you've caused in her name." The Duke turned his full attention to Eleanor, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. He studied her for a long moment before offering a formal bow. "Lady Eleanor, it's an honor to finally meet you. I apologize for the circumstances." Eleanor curtsied, her movements automatic even as her mind raced. Up close, the Duke was even more imposing, but there was something in his eyes that gentled the harsh lines of his face. Concern, perhaps, or the shadow of old pain. Whatever it was, it made him seem more human, less like the invulnerable aristocrat she had imagined. "Your Grace, I am the one who should apologize," she said. "You've taken on a great burden on my behalf." "Not a burden, Lady Eleanor, a responsibility. When we have power, we have an obligation to use it for those who have none." He glanced at Lord Ashford, and his expression hardened. "I've come to discuss the tribunal and to ensure that Lady Eleanor understands what to expect in the coming days." "She'll be making no appearance at any tribunal," Lord Ashford snapped. "This is a matter between men. My daughter's reputation has been damaged enough without parading her before the Lord Chancellor like some common plaintiff. With respect, Lord Ashford, your daughter's testimony may be crucial," the Duke said. "The tribunal will want to understand the circumstances of the marriage contract and whether Lady Eleanor entered into it willingly." "Of course she entered into it willingly," Lord Ashford blustered. "She's an obedient daughter who understands her duty." "Am I?" Eleanor heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Because I don't recall being asked whether I was willing. I recall being informed that I would marry Viscount Thornfield, regardless of my feelings. The silence that followed was electric. Her father looked apoplectic, Thomas proud, and the Duke. The Duke looked satisfied, as if she had just confirmed something he already suspected. "You see," the Duke said quietly, "this is precisely why Lady Eleanor's voice must be heard. The law may see her as property to be transferred, but justice requires that we acknowledge her humanity." Lord Ashford rose to his full height, his face contorted with rage. "I will not stand here and be lectured about justice by a man who knows nothing of the pressures I face. My debts are real, Your Grace, my obligations are real, and my daughter's marriage to Thornfield was the solution to those problems. You've destroyed that solution without offering any alternative. If Thornfield is a fraud, then he has no fortune to offer you," the Duke pointed out, "which means your daughter's sacrifice would have been meaningless anyway. You would have married her off to a man with nothing, and your debts would have remained unpaid." That landed like a blow. Lord Ashford's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. It clearly hadn't occurred to him that if Thornfield's title was false, his wealth might be as well. The Duke had just revealed the fatal flaw in Lord Ashford's plan, and the realization seemed to drain the fight from him. "The tribunal meets in 3 days, the Duke continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "I will be presenting evidence that includes baptismal records from the Thornfield family church, testimony from the family solicitor who represented the elder brother, and sworn statements from witnesses who saw that brother alive in Italy. I have also located the man himself, and he has agreed to return to England to claim his rightful title." Eleanor gasped. "The real Viscount Thornfield is coming here?" "Yes. He has lived in exile for 15 years, believing that his younger brother would eventually tire of pretending and confess the truth. When he learned that a marriage was planned, he felt compelled to return to prevent an innocent woman from being legally bound to an impostor." "Why did he wait so long?" Thomas asked, fascinated despite himself. The Duke's expression darkened. "Because his younger brother tried to kill him once before, and he feared returning would mean finishing the job. It was only when I guaranteed his safety that he agreed to face his brother again." The story was remarkable, almost unbelievable. Eleanor struggled to process all the implications. If what the Duke said was true, then the man she had been set to marry was not only cruel, but also a fraud who had stolen his own brother's identity. The marriage would have been invalid, any children illegitimate, and Eleanor would have been trapped in a legal nightmare. "What happens if the tribunal rules against Thornfield?" she asked. "Then his claim to the title is revoked, his estates are transferred to his brother, and any contracts made under false pretenses are nullified," the Duke explained. "He would likely face criminal charges for fraud and possibly attempted murder. You would be free, Lady Eleanor, with no legal obligation to marry him or anyone else." Freedom. The word hung in the air like a prayer, but Eleanor had learned to be cautious about hope. "And if the tribunal rules in his favor, then I will have been wrong and I will accept the consequences of that," the Duke said. "But I don't believe I am wrong. The evidence is compelling, and the real Viscount Thornfield's story is too detailed to be fabricated." Lord Ashford had been listening with growing dismay, and now he spoke up again. "Even if you're right, even if Thornfield is a fraud, what am I supposed to do about my debts? They don't disappear just because one solution failed." "That is a problem you created through your own poor decisions," the Duke said bluntly, "and it is not a problem that should be solved by sacrificing your daughter. There are other options, Lord Ashford. Selling properties, reducing expenses, negotiating with creditors. But forcing a woman into marriage with a brutal man simply because he offered money? That is not a solution. That is cowardice." The insult hung in the air, dangerous and undeniable. Eleanor saw her father's fists clench, saw the fury building in his eyes. But what could he do? The Duke was right, and more importantly, the Duke had the power to make his displeasure felt throughout society. Crossing him would be social suicide. "I think you've said enough, Your Grace," Lord Ashford managed through gritted teeth. "Unless you have further business here, I must ask you to leave." The Duke nodded, accepting the dismissal. But before he turned to go, he addressed Eleanor once more. "Lady Eleanor, my offer of protection stands. If at any time you feel unsafe here or anywhere else, send word to my residence. I will come immediately." Why? Eleanor asked, unable to contain the question any longer. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? The Duke was silent for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes that looked almost like pain. Because I once failed to protect someone who needed my help. I won't make that mistake again. With that cryptic statement, he bowed and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet space. Eleanor stood frozen, trying to process everything that had just happened. The Duke of Ravencross had just confronted her father in his own home, had insulted him directly, and had essentially declared himself Eleanor's protector. The scandal would be enormous, the gossip relentless. "Well," Thomas said, breaking the silence, "at least we know he's serious about helping you." "Serious about ruining us, you mean?" Lord Ashford snarled. He rounded on Eleanor, his finger jabbing toward her face. "This is your doing. You contacted him, didn't you? You begged for his help like some common beggar." "I accepted help that was offered," Eleanor corrected, "and I'm not sorry for it." Her father's hand rose, and for a terrible moment, Eleanor thought he would strike her. But Thomas stepped between them again, and the presence of the Duke's guards just outside the door seemed to check Lord Ashford's impulse. Instead, he stormed from the room, leaving Eleanor and Thomas alone. "That was terrifying," Eleanor admitted, her legs suddenly weak. She sank into a chair and pressed her hands to her face. "What have I done, Thomas? The Duke just declared war on Father in front of us. The scandal will be everywhere by tonight." "Good," Thomas said fiercely. "Let society gossip. Let them whisper about Father's debts and Thornfield's fraud. At least you're not marrying that monster." "Yet," Eleanor corrected. "The tribunal hasn't ruled. Thornfield might still be legitimate." "Do you really believe that? After everything the Duke said?" Eleanor didn't answer. She wanted to believe that the Duke was right, that salvation was at hand. But she had learned the hard way that hope could be cruel. It was safer to prepare for disappointment than to let herself believe in rescue. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension. Visitors came and went, each one fishing for information about the scandal. Eleanor's father refused to see anyone, barricading himself in his study with a bottle of brandy. Her younger sisters were kept away from the drama, sequestered in the nursery with their governess. Only Thomas remained by Eleanor's side, a steady presence in the chaos. As evening fell, word arrived that Viscount Thornfield was demanding an audience with Lord Ashford. The news sent fresh waves of panic through the household. Thornfield was not a man who took insults lightly, and the Duke's actions had been a direct assault on his honor and claims. Eleanor's father, emboldened by alcohol and rage, agreed to see him. The meeting took place in the study, with Eleanor forbidden from attending. But that didn't stop her and Thomas from listening at the door, desperate to know what was being said. Thornfield's voice was smooth and dangerous, like silk wrapped around a knife. "I'm disappointed in you, Ashford. I offered you a solution to your problems, and you've allowed your daughter to create this circus." "The Duke of Ravencross created it," her father protested. "My daughter is merely a pawn in his game." "Then she's a pawn who will pay the price," Thornfield replied coldly. "When this tribunal clears my name, as it will, I expect you to fulfill our contract. Eleanor will marry me as planned, and she will learn the consequences of embarrassing me publicly." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. If the tribunal ruled in his favor, Thornfield would not forget her defiance. Her punishment would be swift and creative, designed to break her spirit completely. "The Duke has offered her his protection," her father said, and Eleanor could hear the fear in his voice. "If anything happens to her—" "The Duke won't always be watching," Thornfield interrupted. "Accidents happen, Ashford. Wives fall downstairs, eat tainted food, catch mysterious illnesses. The Duke can't protect her from fate." Thomas grabbed Eleanor's arm, his face pale with fury. They both understood the implication. Thornfield was threatening to kill her, was promising that if he was forced to marry her, she wouldn't survive long enough to enjoy the Duke's protection. "I think you should leave," Lord Ashford said, his voice shaking. For all his faults, he apparently drew the line at outright murder threats against his daughter. "The tribunal will settle this matter in 3 days." "Yes, it will," Thornfield agreed. "And when it does, I'll remember everyone who stood against me, including you, Ashford. Perhaps you should be more careful about which powerful men you choose to offend." The door opened suddenly, and Thornfield emerged to find Eleanor and Thomas standing in the hallway. His eyes, cold and predatory, fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Lady Eleanor, how lovely to see you. I trust you're preparing yourself for our wedding, once this unfortunate misunderstanding is cleared up." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to show fear. "If your claim is legitimate, the tribunal will confirm it. If it's not, then there will be no wedding." "Oh, there will be a wedding," Thornfield purred, stepping closer. "Make no mistake about that. And afterward, I'll teach you what happens to women who think they can defy me." Before Eleanor could respond, one of the Duke's guards appeared at the end of the hallway. His presence seemed to break whatever spell Thornfield had been weaving. The false Viscount's expression hardened, and he brushed past Eleanor without another word, leaving the manor in a swirl of his expensive cloak. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, and together they stood in the hallway, processing what had just happened. Thornfield had essentially promised to murder her if they were forced to marry. The threat couldn't have been clearer. "We need to tell the Duke," Thomas said urgently. "Tell him what? That Thornfield threatened me. He won't believe we don't have proof, and even if he did, what could he do? Thornfield hasn't actually done anything illegal yet. He just threatened to kill you," Thomas argued. "No, he spoke in vague terms about accidents that might befall a wife," Eleanor corrected bitterly. "That's not the same as a direct threat. It's clever, really. He's letting me know what to expect without giving anyone grounds to act against him." She was right, and Thomas knew it. Thornfield had been careful in his wording, had couched his threats in language that could be explained away as mere concern for wifely safety. It was maddening, but it was also effective. Even the Duke's protection had limits. He couldn't arrest a man for what he might do in the future. That night, Eleanor barely slept. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound potentially dangerous. The Duke's guards patrolled the grounds, but she knew they couldn't protect her forever. If the tribunal ruled in Thornfield's favor, she would be married off within days, and after that, no amount of protection would save her. She would be legally bound to a man who had essentially promised to murder her, and there would be nothing anyone could do to stop him. The next 2 days passed in agonizing slowness. Eleanor remained in her room as much as possible, venturing out only for meals, and even then only when accompanied by Thomas or the Duke's guards. The whole manor felt like a prison, with Thornfield's threat hanging over everything like a dark cloud. News from London arrived in fragments. The tribunal had convened and was examining evidence. The real Viscount Thornfield, a man named Edmund Thornfield, had arrived from Italy and was staying under the Duke's protection. The false Viscount, whose real name was Richard Thornfield, had hired expensive lawyers and was fighting the claims vigorously. Society was divided, with some rallying around Richard and others speculating that the Duke's evidence must be strong to prompt such a public inquiry. Eleanor tried to focus on other things, but her mind kept returning to the tribunal. Everything depended on those men in their formal robes, examining documents and hearing testimony. They held her future in their hands, and she had no control over their decision. On the morning of the tribunal's final day, Eleanor woke before dawn. She dressed carefully in a deep green gown that made her look older, more serious. Her father had finally relented and agreed that she should attend the proceedings, though whether that was due to a change of heart or simply bowing to the inevitable, Eleanor couldn't say. The Duke's carriage arrived at precisely 8 o'clock. Eleanor, Thomas, and their father climbed inside, the tension between them so thick it could be cut with a knife. No one spoke during the hour-long journey to London. Lord Ashford stared out the window. Thomas held Eleanor's hand, and Eleanor simply tried to keep breathing. When they arrived at the government building where the tribunal was being held, the scene was chaotic. Crowds had gathered to watch the participants arrive, society's elite and common citizens alike drawn by the spectacle. Eleanor saw reporters with notebooks, society matrons with opera glasses, and even a few street vendors selling meat pies and gossip sheets. Her private tragedy had become public entertainment. The Duke was waiting at the entrance, flanked by his secretary and several other men Eleanor didn't recognize. When he saw her emerge from the carriage, His expression softened slightly. He approached and offered his arm. "Lady Eleanor, thank you for coming. I know this can't be easy." Eleanor took his arm, grateful for the support. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the shadows under his eyes. He had been working tirelessly on her behalf, and it showed. She wondered if he had slept at all in the past 3 days. "Is he here?" she asked quietly. "The real Viscount Thornfield?" "Inside, waiting to testify. He's eager to finally reclaim his identity and his life." The Duke paused, then added, "He wanted me to thank you. If you hadn't reached out for help, he might never have found the courage to return." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Her desperate bid for freedom had given another person the same chance. Whatever happened today, at least something good had come from her defiance. They entered the building together, the Duke keeping Eleanor close to his side. The tribunal chamber was already packed with observers, and Eleanor felt dozens of eyes tracking her progress to the seats reserved for those directly involved in the case. She kept her head high, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. Across the room she saw Richard Thornfield, the man she had almost married. He sat with his lawyers, his expression calm and confident. When his eyes met hers, he smiled slightly, and she saw the promise in that smile. He believed he would win. He believed that in a few hours she would be his to do with as he pleased. The Duke must have sensed her fear because his hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of reassurance. "Whatever happens, you're not alone," he murmured. "I won't let him hurt you." It was a bold promise, perhaps even a foolish one, but in that moment Eleanor believed him. The Duke of Ravencross had proven himself to be a man of his word, someone who used his power to protect rather than to oppress. If anyone could keep her safe from Thornfield's vengeance, it was him. The tribunal chair, Lord Justice Pemberton, entered the chamber, and everyone rose. The elderly judge took his seat behind an imposing bench, flanked by 2 other justices, who would help him evaluate the evidence. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Pemberton as he arranged his papers. "This tribunal has been convened to examine claims regarding the legitimate holder of the title of Viscount Thornfield," he began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "We have heard testimony, examined documents, and interviewed witnesses. Today we will hear final arguments and render our decision." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment that would determine her entire future. She felt the Duke's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, and drew strength from it. Whatever happened next, she had fought for herself. That had to count for something. The proceedings began. Lord Justice Pemberton surveyed the packed chamber with the weary gravity of a man who had presided over countless disputes, but rarely one that gripped the public imagination so completely. He adjusted his spectacles, glanced at the thick bundle of documents before him, and cleared his throat. The murmur of the crowd died at once. "We shall resume the matter of the Thornfield title," he announced. "The tribunal will now hear testimony from Mr. Edmund Thornfield, the individual claiming to be the rightful Viscount Thornfield. Approach the bench." A man rose from the seats near the Duke of Ravencross and walked forward with measured steps. Eleanor leaned slightly ahead, tension coiling in her chest. She had heard of him for days now, but this was the first time she truly saw him. Edmund Thornfield looked to be in his early 40s, older than Richard by perhaps 10 years. Lines had been carved into his face not only by age but by hardship, fine grooves around his eyes and deeper ones bracketing his mouth. He carried himself with the reserved dignity of an English nobleman, but the sun-darkened tone of his skin and the faint foreign cut of his coat suggested long years abroad. His hair was a shade lighter than Richard's, more brown than black, with a few threads of grey at the temples, and his eyes were a steady hazel, direct and quietly weary. He bowed to the tribunal and placed one hand over the Bible to take the oath. His voice, when he spoke, was low, resonant and controlled. "I, Edmund James Thornfield, hereby swear that the testimony I give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "Very well," Lord Justice Pemberton said. "Mr. Thornfield, for the record, state your family relations as you claim them." "I am the firstborn son of the late Henry William Thornfield, Viscount Thornfield," Edmund replied. I was born on the 10th of May in the year 1798 at Thornfield Hall. My mother was Lady Beatrice Thornfield, née Sinclair. I had one younger brother, Richard Alexander Thornfield. At the mention of his name, Richard stiffened at his table, though his expression remained carefully schooled. Eleanor felt his gaze flick toward her and then away, like a snake tasting the air and retreating back into its coil. The presiding justice shuffled through several pages and extracted one. Mr. Thornfield, the court has before it a baptismal record from the parish of St. Bartholomew's, near Thornfield Hall, bearing your name and date of birth. Is this your baptismal certificate? Edmund glanced at the document offered to him, nodded once. It is. It matches the copy obtained directly from the parish ledger, Pemberton said. We have also examined records of your father's will and entailed settlements, all of which name you, Edmund James Thornfield, as his heir and successor. Yet 15 years ago, you were declared dead following a supposed accident at sea, and your younger brother assumed the title of Viscount Thornfield. Tell this tribunal in your own words how that came to pass. A hush fell over the room. Even the rustle of skirts and the faint scratch of pens against paper seemed to cease. Eleanor found herself holding her breath. Edmund drew in a slow breath, bracing himself. 15 years ago, he began, I was 27. Our father had died 2 years before. I had inherited the title, but the estates were still recovering from significant debts and mismanagement that had begun in his later years. I was working to stabilize matters, reducing extravagances, selling a portion of unproductive land, and refusing to indulge in the sort of gambling and speculation that had plagued our family for generations. My brother Richard did not share my views. He preferred the life our father had led in his youth, gaming tables, lavish hunts, expensive horses, and constant entertaining. He felt entitled to a level of indulgence the estates could no longer sustain. We argued frequently. I made it clear that as Viscount, I would not endanger our tenants and our name for temporary pleasures. A faint flush crept up Richard's neck, but he said nothing. One of his attorneys scribbled notes furiously. In the autumn of that year, Edmund continued, I arranged to travel to the coast to meet with a shipping agent regarding the sale of a small vessel that had belonged to our father. It was an unnecessary luxury, and I intended to use the funds to pay creditors and to repair cottages on the northern tenant farms. Richard suggested he join me. He was unusually amiable, agreeing with all my plans, praising my prudence. It should have made me suspicious, but I was tired of quarrelling. I accepted his offer. What happened then, Mr. Thornfield? Pemberton prompted. We travelled together to a small port town along the southern coast. The ship was a modest, seaworthy vessel, the Albatross. The plan was to take it for a brief trial along the coast before finalizing the sale. On the morning of our departure, the weather was fair. I recall the sky was clear, the air calm. I boarded with a small crew, men our family had used before on such excursions. Richard came as well. We left harbour just before noon. After an hour at sea, I noticed the crew behaving oddly. They kept exchanging glances, whispering when they thought I was not looking. Richard remained curiously distant, standing at the stern, avoiding conversation. Another hour passed. The wind shifted, stronger, colder. Clouds rolled in, faster than seemed natural. I grew uneasy and approached the captain to suggest we turn back. Edmund's hand tightened subtly on the rail of the witness stand. He told me we would, after another half hour. His voice sounded wrong, forced. I remember turning away, intending to confront Richard, but before I could, something struck the back of my head. I heard nothing but a sudden rush of sound, like the roaring of a waterfall. Then, darkness. A collective shiver passed through the chamber. When I awoke, he said quietly, I was in a small boat, alone in the middle of rough seas. The sky was black with storm clouds. My head throbbed. There was blood in my hair. Rain pelted my face. My wrists were bound with rough rope, poorly tied as if done in haste. I never saw the Albatross again. The words landed with the weight of an accusation that no one dared yet name aloud. I managed to free my hands, Edmund went on. The storm intensified. Waves rose around me like mountains. For hours I fought not to be overturned. At some point I lost consciousness again, convinced I would die. When I finally came to, I was lying on a wooden plank in a dim, unfamiliar room. A foreign tongue echoed around me. Italian. Fishermen had found my boat dashed against the rocks near their village. The Albatross had never returned to harbour. The English papers later reported that it had sunk with all souls on board, including myself. No one knew I had been set adrift beforehand. "How did you learn of that?" the justice asked. "Months later," Edmund replied. "I was severely injured. The villagers had little but gave generously: food, simple medicines, shelter in a small chapel. A local priest spoke some English. He nursed me through fever and infection. I recovered slowly. Nearly a year passed before I was strong enough to travel inland in search of proper records or news of England. By then, communication was difficult. The war on the continent had flared. Routes were disrupted. I eventually reached a larger city, where I found old English newspapers. One carried an account of the tragic loss of the Albatross and the death of Edmund, Viscount Thornfield, leaving behind his grieving younger brother, Richard, who would now assume the title. A rustle of shock swept through the observers. "You believed your brother had arranged your disappearance?" Pemberton asked. "I suspected," Edmund said evenly. "At the very least, he knew I had not died as reported. He alone stood to benefit from my death. The crew who had sailed with us never returned. They either perished or were paid to vanish. In either case, I could not safely return without proof, and I had none beyond my word. Meanwhile, word spread that war was once again raging across Europe. Englishmen abroad were not always welcome. I chose to survive. For years I moved from place to place, working where I could, translating documents, teaching English, assisting merchants. Eventually, I settled in Italy, under an assumed name. I wrote letters to England, but they were returned or lost. I had no one I truly trusted except one elderly solicitor who had once served our father. I did send a letter to him, but never received a reply. I feared Richard had intercepted it. Lord Justice Pemberton tapped a document. "We have before us a statement from Mr. Alistair Grant, former solicitor to the late Viscount Thornfield, currently residing in Bath. He testifies that 15 years ago he received one letter bearing your hand and seal, Mr. Thornfield, and that when he sought to act upon it, he was dismissed from Richard Thornfield's service and threatened with ruin if he pursued phantoms. He left England for several years following that incident. His testimony corroborates your claims." A soft, incredulous murmur flickered through the chamber, like wind through leaves. "Why did you not return sooner?" one of the associate justices asked. Edmund's shoulders stiffened. "Because the last time I stood with my brother near the sea, I awoke in a boat, meant to drown me. I had no allies powerful enough to counter his word at home. Our father was gone. Our mother had died years before. Richard had the estates, the name, the money, and the connections. I might have been seized, declared an impostor, and quietly disposed of. I had seen firsthand what men will do for inheritance." His gaze flickered briefly to the Duke of Ravencross, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had changed that calculation. "It was only when His Grace, the Duke of Ravencross, found me in Italy years later and promised his support and protection that I dared return. Even then I hesitated, but when I learned that Richard intended to marry an innocent woman under a title gained through fraud, I could no longer remain silent." Eleanor felt that sentence settle over her like a tangible weight. An innocent woman, her. Lord Justice Pemberton regarded Edmund steadily. "Mr. Thornfield, are you prepared to swear, before this tribunal and before God, that your account is true, and that you are indeed the firstborn and rightful heir to the Thornfield title?" "I am," Edmund replied without hesitation. "I swear it upon my soul." The justice nodded and gestured to the clerk. "Enter his oath into the record." The moment carried a solemnity that pressed on everyone present. Eleanor's fingers dug slightly into the carved armrest of her chair. Beside her, the Duke remained utterly still, his expression that of a man who had fought too many battles to relax before the final blow was struck. "Very well," Pemberton said. "You may step down for now, Mr. Thornfield. Counsel for Mr. Richard Thornfield will have the opportunity to question you shortly." Edmund bowed once more and returned to his seat near the Duke. As he did, he allowed his gaze to rest briefly on Eleanor. It was not a lingering look, not inappropriate, but there was a quiet apology in it. A silent, "I am sorry you were ever entangled in this." She inclined her head in the smallest acknowledgement. "Now," Pemberton said, turning to the opposite side of the chamber, "we call Mr. Richard Thornfield, currently recognized as Viscount Thornfield, to testify." Richard rose. His movements were slower than usual, more deliberate, as though he were consciously arranging every gesture for the onlookers' benefit. He approached the stand, all polished elegance in his perfectly tailored coat and flawless cravat. He placed his hand upon the Bible, repeated the oath without the smallest tremor, and lifted his chin with aristocratic composure. "Mr. Thornfield," the justice began, careful to omit the title for the moment, "you have heard your brother's account. How do you respond to these claims?" Richard's lips curved in a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "My lords, what you have heard is a story," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "A compelling and sentimental tale, undoubtedly honed through long years of idleness and regret. But tales do not make truth, facts do." "And what are the facts, in your view?" Pemberton asked. "The facts," Richard said, "are that 15 years ago a vessel belonging to my late father was lost at sea with all souls aboard. Wreckage was recovered bearing the ship's name. Witnesses attested to my brother's boarding that ship. Grief-stricken as I was, I accepted the tragic reality and did what duty required. I assumed the title and responsibilities of Viscount Thornfield. For 15 years I have managed the estates, paid debts, kept our tenants fed and housed, served in Parliament, and upheld my family's honour." Several in the crowd nodded, impressed by the recitation. "And then," Richard continued smoothly, "just as I am on the cusp of cementing an advantageous match, one that would save another ancient family from ruin, a stranger appears in Italy, claiming to be my long-dead brother. A man of modest means, living under an assumed name, whose story conveniently surfaces only when there is title and fortune to be regained." He turned his gaze briefly toward Edmund, then to the Duke, then, pointedly, to Eleanor. "One must ask," he murmured, "who benefits from this spectacle? A man who reappears from the dead with no proof beyond a priest's anecdote and a scattering of unverifiable documents? Or a powerful duke who has never concealed his disdain for me, seizing the opportunity to undermine my position and elevate his own influence? Or perhaps a young lady desperate to avoid a marriage arranged by her father, grasping at an improbable tale as the perfect means to escape her obligations?" A sharp sting went through Eleanor at that. The subtle accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several society ladies present leaned toward each other, whispering behind gloved hands. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Eleanor forced herself not to look away from Richard's gaze. He wanted her to flinch, to appear weak or guilty. She would not grant him that satisfaction. Lord Justice Pemberton cleared his throat. "Mr. Thornfield, this tribunal is not concerned with gossip or speculation. Address the evidence." "Gladly, my lord," Richard replied with a graceful incline of his head. "The so-called baptismal record. Any clever forger with access to old parish books and sufficient coin could arrange it. The will and entails? Copies kept by a worn-out solicitor long since dismissed for incompetence. And as for Mr. Edmund Thornfield standing there so nobly," he gave a small derisive laugh, "have any of you known him these past 15 years? Who can attest that he has not changed his story, adopted another man's name, or been carefully coached?" The words were skillfully chosen, designed not to refute outright but to seed doubt. Eleanor could sense the shift in the room, the subtle drawing back of sympathy as uncertainty crept in. "Consider also," Richard went on, "how much has been made of my supposed character. Rumors, whispers, tales of excess and brutality. Convenient, are they not? Paint me as a villain, and any story told against me gains plausibility. Judge me first, and you need not scrutinize the evidence." He let his gaze sweep the chamber. "Yet who among you has personally witnessed the atrocities I am accused of? Who here can testify that I have ever been anything other than a gentleman of standing, generous in my entertainments, attentive to my parliamentary duties, punctual in my rents, and faithful in my tithes? Do I gamble? Yes, as many gentlemen do. Do I host lively gatherings? Guilty. But is that a crime? Hardly. The man was good. Too good. Eleanor felt a flicker of apprehension. She glanced at the Duke, wondering how he meant to counter such rhetorical skill. "Regarding Lady Eleanor Ashford," Richard continued, casually invoking her name as though tasting it, "I sought nothing more than an alliance that would benefit them both, her family and mine." Lord Ashford approached me with particular urgency. His eyes glittered maliciously. Her father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I agreed to settle significant debts in exchange for a marriage founded on mutual advantage. Such arrangements are neither uncommon nor dishonorable. Had this baseless inquiry not arisen, the wedding would have taken place quietly, and Lady Eleanor would have found herself well provided for as Viscountess Thornfield. Now, due to the interference of third parties, she has been thrust into scandal. Tell me, my lords, who truly has wronged her? The man who offered her a secure future, or those who dragged her name through the mud to advance their own agendas?" The question rippled through the listeners like a challenge. Lord Justice Pemberton leaned back, fingers steepled. "Mr. Thornfield, you speak persuasively. However, this tribunal is not a theatre for rhetoric. We have documents, sworn statements, and multiple independent witnesses supporting Mr. Edmund Thornfield's identity. What substantive evidence do you provide to prove that he is not who he claims to be?" Richard's confident facade flickered for the briefest moment. He had gambled on charm and insinuation. Now, forced to confront the solid weight of proof, he hesitated. "My lords," he said at last, "it is impossible to prove a negative. I cannot produce a certificate stating, 'This man is not my brother,' any more than I could prove that some foreigner claiming to be you is not. I can only appeal to common sense. If my brother lived these 15 years, why did he not return sooner? Why did he never once attempt to contact me directly? Why did he wait until a wealthy duke discovered him before stepping forward? Why does every piece of evidence originate with men under the duke's influence or drawn from dusty ledgers no one has examined for decades?" The words rang out, bold and confident, catching more than a few nods from those inclined to distrust power, even that of a duke. Eleanor's heart thudded. She understood what he was doing, turning suspicion away from himself and casting it upon the man who had dared to challenge him. It was clever and, to an impartial observer, almost convincing. Pemberton paused, then turned toward the Duke's side of the chamber. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscross, will now be heard as principal witness for the supporting party." All eyes swung to Sebastian. He rose without hurry. Where Richard sparkled and flowed like a practiced orator, Sebastian moved with the inexorable steadiness of a man accustomed to command on battlefields rather than in drawing rooms. He did not seem to care whether anyone liked him. He cared that they listened. He took the oath, his voice low and firm, then faced the bench. "Your lordships," he began, "Mr. Richard Thornfield is correct in one regard. This matter is not about rumour. It is about evidence. So let us speak plainly of what that evidence is." He gestured to the clerk, who produced a small stack of documents and passed them up. "First," Sebastian said, "the baptismal record of Edmund James Thornfield from the parish book of St. Bartholomew's, verified by the current vicar, who is present and has sworn that the entry has not been altered." The elderly vicar, seated among the witnesses, rose briefly at the justice's signal and bowed, confirming the Duke's statement. "Second," Sebastian continued, "the original copy of the late Henry Thornfield's will and entail, kept in the strong-box of his long-time solicitor, Mr. Alistair Grant, who is also present and has given sworn testimony that he was dismissed for attempting to act on a letter received from Edmund Thornfield years after his supposed death. Mr. Grant, a gentleman with thinning hair and worried eyes, nodded stiffly at the mention of his name. Third, Sebastian said, testimony from Signor Paolo Rossi, a fisherman from the Ligurian coast, who rescued an unidentified Englishman from the wreckage of a small boat during a violent storm 15 years ago. He is here today, speaks some English, and has identified Edmund Thornfield as the man he pulled from the sea. His account matches, in date and circumstance, the loss of the Albatross. The small Italian man stood up at the prompt, cap in hand, dark eyes anxious but resolute. Even from where she sat, Eleanor could see the calluses on his hands, the visible mark of a life at sea. Fourth, the Duke went on, records from Italian authorities documenting a foreign national registering residence under the name Edward Thorne arrived from England shortly after the sinking of the Albatross. His physical description matches Edmund Thornfield. The handwriting in those records matches his own, as confirmed by an expert. He paused only long enough for the clerk to place the papers before the justices. "And finally," Sebastian said, "we have not merely documents, but scars and memory. Edmund Thornfield bears an old wound on the back of his skull, consistent with a blunt force blow sustained around the time of the ship's disappearance. He can describe in detail the interior of Thornfield Hall, including rooms which have since been altered, family artifacts, private childhood incidents only a member of the household would know. I took the liberty of questioning him extensively before agreeing to bring this matter forward. On 3 separate occasions, I asked him for the location of a hidden compartment in his father's study at Thornfield Hall, one which, according to a former steward, was known only to the late Viscount and his heir. Edmund described it accurately, down to the catch concealed in the carved lion's paw on the leg of the writing desk. When that compartment was examined, it contained letters from Henry Thornfield addressed to my beloved son Edmund, along with early drafts of the will that eventually named him heir. Those letters and the desk itself are available for your inspection." A small but visible ripple of impact crossed Pemberton's features. This, Eleanor sensed, was new even to him. A hidden compartment, letters, specific details no outsider could easily learn. It was powerful proof. Richard's mask slipped for one heartbeat. A flash of fury quickly leashed. "Your lordships," Sebastian said softly, "a man may forge a single document. He may bribe a single witness. He may even invent a story. But he cannot so easily fabricate a life. Its wounds, its memories, its private corners, especially not under repeated skeptical questioning by someone with nothing to gain and much to lose." He let that sink in, then turned his gaze toward Richard, his expression utterly without warmth. Now contrast this with Mr. Richard Thornfield's defense. He offers no evidence beyond his long enjoyment of the title and his word that his brother is dead. He does not address why the only solicitor who received a letter from Edmund was summarily dismissed. He does not explain why he alone survived the wreck of a ship that conveniently removed every other direct witness to his brother's fate. He cannot say how Edmund, if an impostor, acquired intimate knowledge of hidden compartments and private family correspondence. Sebastian's voice remained calm, but beneath that calm ran a current of barely leashed righteous anger. "This is not a play," he said quietly. "This is not a matter of which man cuts the handsomer figure at a ball or tells the cleverer story. It is a question of truth. And the truth, supported by documents, witnesses, and reason, is that Edmund Thornfield did not die 15 years ago, but was left to die, cast adrift at sea, while his younger brother claimed his name, his title, and his life." The words struck like a hammer blow. Several ladies gasped aloud. One gentleman muttered an oath under his breath. Eleanor felt the skin along her arms prickle. Lord Justice Pemberton glanced toward Richard. "Mr. Thornfield, have you anything to say in response to these specific points? The hidden compartment, the letters, the testimony of your former solicitor and the Italian fisherman?" Richard's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, his confidence faltered visibly. He began, then rallied. "I can only say that I do not know how this impostor has obtained such knowledge or forged such evidence. The steward who revealed the secret compartment might have been bribed. The letters could be fabricated. The fisherman—" "Enough," Pemberton cut in, his tone suddenly sharp. "You cast suspicion on everyone except yourself, Mr. Thornfield, while offering nothing but conjecture in your own defense. This tribunal deals in proof, not in convenient I do not knows." A flush of anger crawled up Richard's cheeks. His eyes flickered toward Eleanor again, this time not with charm, but with a flash of venom that turned her stomach cold. "There is one more matter," the justice said, rifling through a smaller packet of papers. "This tribunal has also received statements from servants formerly employed at your estate, men and women who left your service under what they describe as distressing circumstances. Their accounts speak to character and conduct which, while not directly probative of your claim to the title, are relevant when considering credibility." Eleanor stiffened. She had not known this part was coming. Pemberton continued, "Several report patterns of cruelty, intimidation, and what one footman describes as amusements that involved physical torment of those unable to defend themselves. There is mention of a young lady who died under suspicious circumstances while staying under your roof. Another speaks of threats made against any who questioned your word." Gasps and shocked murmurs broke out. Many had whispered such rumors. Now they were finding their way into official proceedings. "These statements have been supplied through the Duke of Ravencross's efforts," Pemberton said, shooting Sebastian a brief, appraising look. "They are sworn and corroborated where possible. Mr. Thornfield, do you deny them?" Richard's eyes blazed. "I deny that they have any bearing on the question at hand. Malcontents and dismissed servants will say anything for coin and revenge. And if my household has ever witnessed temper or discipline, that is hardly unusual among men of my station. As for the young lady," he smiled thinly, "a tragic illness, nothing more." Eleanor clenched her hands together until her nails bit into her palms. The young lady in question, she suspected, was the unfortunate bride who had died in her sleep 2 years ago, the one everyone had whispered about and no one had dared investigate. At Pemberton's nod, one of the associate justices spoke up. "Lady Eleanor Ashford is present, is she not?" Every head turned. Eleanor's heart lurched into her throat. "She is," answered the Duke quietly. "With the court's permission, she is prepared to offer limited testimony as to the circumstances of her engagement and what she learned of Mr. Richard Thornfield's character." The justice nodded. "Call Lady Eleanor Ashford." Eleanor felt the world tilt. It took effort to lift herself from her seat. Thomas's hand briefly squeezed hers. She clung to that small anchor, then released it and walked toward the stand. Each step seemed louder than it had any right to be. The chamber that had felt large a moment ago now closed around her, as though everyone present were moving closer. She took the oath with a steady voice, though her hands betrayed a faint tremor. When she turned to face the bench, she was conscious of the weight of dozens of gazes, and of one in particular burning into her from the defense table. "Lady Eleanor," Pemberton said gently, "you are not on trial here. This tribunal understands the delicacy of your position. You will not be asked to disclose anything of a private feminine nature. Our interest lies only in matters that touch upon the truth of Mr. Richard Thornfield's character and the circumstances of your engagement." "Yes, my lord," she said. "Begin," he prompted. Eleanor drew a quiet breath. "My father's financial distress is not a secret, my lord. It has been the subject of whispers for some time. Roughly 3 months ago I was informed, not asked but informed, that I was to marry Viscount Thornfield." She did not look at Richard as she said the title. "I had never conversed with him before that point, beyond a brief exchange at a ball. I was not consulted about my wishes or feelings. The arrangement was presented to me as a necessity." "Did you protest?" one of the associate justices asked. "Yes, my lord, repeatedly. I expressed my fears and objections to my father and my mother's sister, who lives with us. I begged to be released from the engagement. My father refused. He said Thornfield's offer was the only way to save our family from ruin. When I suggested other options, selling land, reducing our expenses, he dismissed them." "And what of Mr. Thornfield himself?" Pemberton asked. "Did you interact with him after the engagement was arranged?" "On a few occasions," she said tightly. "He visited our house to discuss the wedding and inspect the property he intended to add to his holdings. During those visits, I observed certain things." "Speak plainly, Lady Eleanor," the justice encouraged. She forced herself to. "I saw him strike a footman across the face for spilling a glass of wine, not a backhand or a careless blow, a deliberate hard strike that knocked the man to the floor. The footman apologized repeatedly while bleeding from the mouth. Mr. Thornfield laughed and told him to be grateful it was not worse." A faint murmur of outrage stirred the crowd. "On another occasion," Eleanor continued, "I overheard him speaking with my father in the study. They did not know I was near. He said, 'You understand, Ashford, that once she is my wife, she is mine to do with as I please. I don't care if she weeps or begs. I will brook no disobedience." My father responded that I would learn my place. Her father shifted in his seat, colour draining from his face. For a moment Eleanor almost pitied him. Almost. Then she remembered nights spent awake, imagining the future to which he had so willingly sentenced her. "Did Mr. Thornfield ever direct any threats toward you specifically?" Pemberton asked. "Not at first," she said. "He was polite in company, charming. He would bring extravagant gifts, speak graciously to my sisters, flatter my father. But when we were alone, his manner changed. His compliments took on an edge. He would say things like, 'A wife's fear can be very diverting when properly managed,' or 'I look forward to teaching you what happens when you displease me,' always said with a smile that made light of the words, as though they were a jest. But they did not feel like jest to me." "Did you tell anyone?" "I told my brother," she said, voice firming as she thought of Thomas at her side in darker hours. "He offered to challenge Mr. Thornfield. My mother's sister stopped him, for good reason. A duel would have ruined us faster. I spoke again to my father. He accused me of hysterics. I confided in our long-time maid, Margaret, who believed me but could do little." "And then you were contacted by the Duke of Ravencross," Pemberton said. "Yes, my lord. He sent me a letter explaining that he had discovered evidence suggesting Mr. Thornfield's title was fraudulent. He offered to bring the matter before the authorities, but said he would not act without my consent. He gave me a choice." The word lingered in the air like a fragile thing. "For months I had been told I had none," she went on. "No choice but to marry, no choice but to accept a future I feared. The Duke's letter was the first time anyone had suggested that my wishes, my safety might matter. I considered the risk, the scandal, the danger if the evidence proved false. But I had already been threatened with a lifetime in the power of a man who took pleasure in cruelty. I decided that facing scandal and uncertainty was better than certainty of abuse." Her throat tightened, but she pushed onward. The women in the gallery hung on every word. Many of the men looked deeply uncomfortable. "So I sent word to the Duke," she finished. "He proceeded as he has described, bringing the evidence to you. Mr. Thornfield visited our house after the inquiry was announced. I heard him tell my father that when the tribunal cleared his name, he would teach me what happened to women who embarrassed him, and that accidents happen. Wives fall downstairs, eat tainted food, catch mysterious illnesses. He spoke of it as hypothetical, almost humorously, but there was no humor in his eyes. A hush descended so intense that the ticking of the great clock on the far wall became sharply audible. Pemberton's face had hardened. "Did anyone else hear these remarks?" "My brother was in the hall with me," Eleanor said. "We both heard them." Thomas rose at that cue, bowing to the bench. "I confirm it, my lord, word for word." Richard's attorney leapt to his feet. "My lord, these are vague recollections of an overheard conversation, easily—" "Sit down," Pemberton snapped. "You will have your turn to question, but you will not interrupt sworn testimony." The man paled and sank into his seat again. Pemberton regarded Eleanor with something that might almost have been sympathy. "Lady Eleanor," he said more softly, "you have shown courage in speaking here today. Is there anything else you wish this tribunal to understand?" She hesitated. In that pause, Eleanor felt the weight of more than her own fate. She thought of her sisters, of servants living under the whims of cruel men, of the nameless girl who had died in Thornfield's house. "Yes, my lord," she said at last. "I wish you to understand that if this inquiry had not been opened, I would have obeyed my father and married Mr. Thornfield. I would have done so to save my family from ruin. I would have walked to that altar fully aware that I was stepping into a life of fear. That knowledge was crushing. The Duke's intervention did not create my terror, it only named it." Her voice caught, but she did not break. "Women in my position are often described as sheltered, foolish, or dramatic when we express fear. But fear is sometimes just clear-sightedness without power. I saw what waited for me. I had no means to resist. The Duke's letter did not seduce me away from duty. It gave me a means to survive my duty without being destroyed by it." She swallowed, then concluded, "Whatever you decide today about the title of Thornfield, I beg you to see me, not as a pawn or a scandal, but as a person. I cannot choose who holds that title, but I should have the right to choose not to bind my life to a man who made sport of threats and violence. An ache had formed behind her eyes, but she refused to let tears fall. She stood there, straight-backed and pale, awaiting whatever judgment would come. Lord Justice Pemberton inclined his head. "Thank you, Lady Eleanor. You may step down." Her legs felt strangely numb as she returned to her seat. The Duke's hand brushed very lightly against her elbow, steadying her as she sat. The touch was fleeting but sure, a wordless well done. Richard's counsel rose to question her, but Pemberton cut him short. "You may not harass this witness with insinuations of impropriety," the Justice warned. "You may ask only for clarification on factual points." Cornered, the attorney managed only a few weak questions about dates and specific wording, which Eleanor answered calmly and without contradiction. He soon abandoned the effort. His earlier confidence diminished. After additional brief testimony from the Italian fisherman and the former Thornfield solicitor, both of which reinforced Edmund's account, the justices retired to their private chamber to deliberate. The room erupted into hushed chaos the moment they left. Whispers, hurried notes, darting glances. People speculated in fierce undertones about which way the decision would fall. Eleanor's ears buzzed. She felt suspended, as if her body sat in the bench but her mind hovered somewhere above, looking down at the chamber like a scene on a stage. Beside her, Thomas squeezed her hand until her fingers tingled. On her other side, the Duke sat very still, eyes trained on the door through which the justices had disappeared. "How long will they take?" Thomas muttered. "As long as they must," Sebastian said quietly. "But they have more than enough before them." Eleanor dared a glance at him, studying the profile of his face. The strong line of his jaw, the scar that traced from temple to jawline, the faint tension at the corner of his mouth. He seemed carved from stone, but she sensed the coil of anxiety within him. He had risked much in bringing this forward: reputation, alliances, even physical safety given Richard's nature. "Your Grace," she whispered, I hope this does not ruin you." He turned to her, surprise flickering in his gaze, quickly followed by a wry warmth. "If it does, at least I will be ruined for the right reasons." "You speak as if that is a small thing," she murmured. "It is not a small thing," he replied. "Perhaps it is the only thing." Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They both knew what it meant to act against the expectations of their station, to spend personal currency, reputation, safety, for something as intangible as principle. The justices were gone for what felt like hours, though in truth it was less than one. Conversation ebbed and flowed. People left to stretch their legs, then hurried back for fear of missing the decision. Reporters craned their necks to see better. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman wept quietly, perhaps out of empathy, perhaps out of some private memory touched by the morning's testimony. At last, the door behind the bench opened. The justices filed back in, faces grave and inscrutable. Everyone surged to their feet. Even Richard, who had spent the interval in tense, whispered consultation with his attorneys, rose and straightened his coat, schooling his expression into one of dignified expectation. Lord Justice Pemberton took his seat and cleared his throat. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This tribunal," he began, voice resonant, "has carefully examined the evidence and testimony presented regarding the claim to the title and estates of Thornfield. We have considered the legal documents, the corroborating witnesses, and the conduct and credibility of both Edmund and Richard Thornfield." He paused, and the silence sharpened. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she feared it might burst. "It is the unanimous judgment of this tribunal," Pemberton said, "that Edmund James Thornfield is indeed the firstborn son and lawful heir of the late Henry William Thornfield, and thus the rightful holder of the title of Viscount Thornfield." A wave of sound crashed through the chamber, gasps, exclamations, cries of disbelief and triumph. Eleanor's knees went weak. Thomas exhaled a pent-up shout of joy before clapping a hand over his own mouth. Pemberton's voice cut through the uproar. "Furthermore, it is the judgment of this tribunal that Richard Alexander Thornfield wrongfully assumed that title upon his brother's presumed death, and has, for 15 years, enjoyed the benefits and authority thereof without legal right." Richard's face turned ashen. He gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles whitened. "Effective immediately," Pemberton continued. "Richard Alexander Thornfield is stripped of the title of Viscount Thornfield and of all associated privileges. The estates and entailed properties of Thornfield are to be restored to Edmund James Thornfield, pending the formalities of legal transfer. Any contracts or agreements predicated on Richard Alexander Thornfield's claim to that title, including but not limited to marriage settlements, are hereby declared null and void." The words rang in Eleanor's ears like church bells at dawn. Null and void, two simple words that changed everything. Her engagement, all the terror, the looming dread, the wedding dress hanging like a shroud in her wardrobe, erased in a single stroke of legal authority. The future that had seemed an iron chain wrapped around her throat dissolved like mist in the sun. "In light of testimony suggesting intentional harm," Pemberton added, and his eyes hardened as they settled upon Richard, "this tribunal also recommends that the Crown's prosecutors review the circumstances surrounding the loss of the vessel Albatross and the presumed death of Edmund James Thornfield for potential criminal charges. While it is beyond the scope of this proceeding to convict, the evidence of a deliberate attempt upon a man's life is too grave to ignore." That last blow visibly staggered Richard. For an instant all masks dropped. Naked hatred blazed from his eyes, directed at Edmund, at the Duke, at Eleanor. She shrank back instinctively. The look promised retribution, raw and unrestrained. The Duke noticed. His hand settled lightly but unmistakably over hers on the bench, a small barrier between her and that venomous stare. "Order," Pemberton commanded. "This tribunal is adjourned." The gavel fell. The chamber exploded into noise. Reporters surged to their feet, scribbling furiously. Society matrons clutched at their pearls. Young ladies whispered excitedly of scandal and redemption. Some people craned their necks to get a better view of Edmund, the returned heir. Others stared openly at Eleanor and the Duke, hungry for clues to whatever story they would later tell. Eleanor's mind spun. She had expected to feel only elation, only relief. Instead, a dizzying mixture flooded her. Disbelief, gratitude so sharp it hurt, a delayed wave of terror at what might have been, and a strange, trembling sense of possibility. Thomas turned to her, eyes shining. "You're free," he whispered, voice thick. "Ellie, you're actually free." She let out a shaky breath that turned into something almost like a laugh. It sounded foreign to her ears, too light for all that had just passed, but it was real. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, her gaze found the Duke's. He had risen to exchange a few brief words with Edmund, but now he turned back to her, his expression unguardedly warm for the first time since she had known him. "It is done," he said simply. "You did this," she replied, the words almost a whisper. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You did when you chose to fight. I merely stood where I ought to have stood all along." Before either of them could say more, Richard shouldered his way between them, ignoring the Duke entirely. His attorneys hovered anxiously at his back, but he brushed them off. His attention was fixed like a blade on Eleanor. "Enjoy your victory, Lady Eleanor," he said, voice low enough that only a handful of people nearby could hear. "You may have escaped the altar, but you have not escaped me." The air between them chilled. Eleanor felt that old familiar recoil of dread, but this time there was something new layered over it. Anger. She was tired of being the hunted, the cornered, tired of every room shrinking whenever he entered. "You have no claim over me," she said quietly but firmly. "Not in law. Not in honor." His smile was a twisted thing. "Law is a fragile shield. Accidents, as I mentioned before, do not ask the law's permission." The Duke stepped smoothly between them, his tone silk over iron. "Careful, Mr. Richard, whatever you will now call yourself. Threats made in public within earshot of half the ton and court officials are unwise, particularly when criminal charges may soon hang over your head." Richard's eyes snapped to him. For a heartbeat, the two men simply stared at each other, predator and immovable wall. Then Richard gave a short, ugly laugh. "Do you think your title will protect you forever, Ravencross?" he sneered. You've made an enemy today who does not forget. You were already my enemy, Sebastian replied calmly. Now you are also an exposed fraud. I leave it to you to decide which is the worse position. A muscle jumped in Richard's jaw. Without another word, he turned sharply on his heel and stalked out, his coat flaring behind him. His attorneys scrambled to follow. Several onlookers stepped hastily aside, as if his fury might be contagious. Only when he had disappeared from view did Eleanor exhale fully. Her knees trembled in the aftermath. The Duke turned back to her at once. "You should not travel home unguarded," he said. "Not today. I will escort you and remain until I am satisfied that your father understands the reality of the situation and that extra precautions are in place." Eleanor opened her mouth to demur, then stopped. The impulse to be agreeable, to insist she would cause no more trouble, rose out of habit. She suppressed it. Today she had stood before a tribunal and insisted on being seen as a person, not a pawn. It would be a poor beginning to her freedom to slip back into docility now. "Yes," she said instead. "Thank you. I would welcome your company." His eyes flickered with something like relief. "Good." Edmund Thornfield approached just then, escorted by his solicitor. Up close, the resemblance between him and Richard was unmistakable in the line of cheek and brow, though softened by a greater gentleness. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing deeply, "we have not been properly introduced. It grieves me that the first true act of my return was to drag you through public turmoil. You have my profound apologies for what my brother would have done, and for my delay in preventing it." "Your arrival saved me," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "If you must apologize, then so must I for the years you spent in exile while England believed you dead. But blame belongs only to the man who put you in that boat." Edmund's eyes darkened briefly, then lightened as he looked between her and the Duke. "Ravencross speaks of your courage," he said. "I see now he did not exaggerate. Few would have risked such scandal, and fewer still would have spoken as plainly as you did today." Eleanor flushed faintly, uncertain how to receive such open praise. "I only said what was true." "Truth spoken at the wrong time can destroy," Edmund said. "Truth spoken at the right time can save. You chose your moment well." His tone was devoid of flirtation, carrying instead a quiet respect that eased some of the tension in her shoulders. He turned then to the Duke. "I'm in your debt, Ravencross," he said simply. "We are even," Sebastian replied. "You once saved my life on a hill outside Salamanca when a French sharpshooter had me in his sights. Consider this repayment deferred far too long." Eleanor blinked. "You knew each other before this?" The men exchanged a look threaded with shared history. "Briefly," Edmund said. "Long ago, in rather less comfortable surroundings. War forges strange alliances, and breaks the foolish distinction between those born titled and those born to less," Sebastian added. "Out there, courage will stand between you and death more readily than any coat of arms. I trust men I bled beside more than I trust most who share my class." Eleanor absorbed that with interest. It explained much about him: his willingness to expend social capital for others, his instinctive defense of the vulnerable. He had not learned his code in ballrooms, but on battlefields. With formalities concluded, the crowd began to disperse, each person eager to be the first to relate the tale elsewhere. The Duke arranged for his carriage to take Eleanor, Thomas, and Lord Ashford home, while another would convey Edmund to private lodgings in town until legal matters regarding his estate were settled. The journey back to Blackmore Manor took place under a strained silence. Lord Ashford sat opposite Eleanor, avoiding her gaze. Shame, anger, and something like wounded pride warred across his face. Thomas hovered protectively at her side. The Duke rode facing her, a quiet, watchful presence. The landscape rolled by the window. Bare fields, hedgerows slick with recent rain, villages buzzing with talk of the day's sensational decision. Eleanor watched it without truly seeing, her mind still in that chamber, hearing again the gavels fall and Pemberton's pronouncement. When at last they arrived at Blackmore Manor, the servant's curiosity was scarcely concealed. Eyes peeked from behind doorways and pillars. Margaret waited near the entrance, her hands twisting in her apron, anxiety written plainly on her face. Eleanor stepped out first, the Duke's hand steady beneath her elbow as she descended from the carriage. Margaret scanned her mistress's face, then broke into relieved tears. "Oh, my lady," she breathed, clasping Eleanor's hands, "I prayed all morning." Eleanor squeezed them back. "Your prayers were heard. The tribunal ruled against him. The engagement is over." Margaret choked on a sob that was half laughter. "Bless the Lord and bless that Duke, and bless whoever had the sense to listen to you." Lord Ashford cleared his throat sharply, recalling everyone to propriety. He ushered them into his study, a room that, to Eleanor, would forever smell of stale brandy and desperation. Once the door closed, silence stretched tautly between father and daughter, daughter and Duke. "Well," Lord Ashford said at last, voice brittle, "it appears you have won, Eleanor." "This was not a contest," she replied quietly. "At least, not one I chose. I never sought to humiliate you. I only wished not to be destroyed." When at last they arrived at Blackmore Manor, the servants' curiosity was scarcely concealed. Eyes peeked from behind doorways and pillars. Margaret waited near the entrance, her hands twisting in her apron, anxiety written plainly on her face. Eleanor stepped out first, the Duke's hand steady beneath her elbow as she descended from the carriage. Margaret scanned her mistress's face, then broke into relieved tears. "Oh, my lady," she breathed, clasping Eleanor's hands, "I prayed all morning." Eleanor squeezed them back. "Your prayers were heard. The tribunal ruled against him. The engagement is over." Margaret choked on a sob that was half laughter. "Bless the Lord and bless that Duke, and bless whoever had the sense to listen to you." Lord Ashford cleared his throat sharply, recalling everyone to propriety. He ushered them into his study, a room that, to Eleanor, would forever smell of stale brandy and desperation. Once the door closed, silence stretched tautly between father and daughter, daughter and Duke. "Well," Lord Ashford said at last, voice brittle, "it appears you have won, Eleanor." "This was not a contest," she replied quietly. "At least, not one I chose. I never sought to humiliate you. I only wished not to be destroyed." Her father flinched. "Destroyed? Such dramatics." Ravenscroft spoke then, his tone measured, devoid of heat. "Lord Ashford, your daughter's testimony today spared you far greater humiliation. Had she kept silent and allowed the marriage to proceed, you would now be the man who sold his child to a fraud, for a debt that would, in the end, remain unpaid. As it stands, you can claim, truthfully, that you were deceived, as were many others, by a man who usurped his brother's place." Ashford's jaw worked. "You make it sound almost noble." "There is nothing noble in failing to protect those dependent upon you," Sebastian said plainly. "But there is still time to do better." The words landed with stark weight. For a moment Lord Ashford seemed older than Eleanor had ever seen him, his shoulders sagging under a burden long denied. "What would you have me do, Your Grace?" he asked bitterly. "I am ruined. Without Thornfield's settlement, my creditors will devour what little remains. My daughter's prospects are finished. My son's future is uncertain. And you—" his gaze slashed to Eleanor, "you are now a subject of scandal. No respectable man will want you for a wife." Something inside Eleanor, fragile but newly bolstered, solidified. "Perhaps that is just as well," she said softly. "If respectable men demand unquestioning obedience and sacrifice without regard for a woman's well-being, I would rather remain unwanted. My worth is not measured by how useful I am in paying your debts." Her father stared at her, stunned. She had never spoken to him thus. The Duke remained silent, but there was a faint, unmistakable light in his eyes. Approval, perhaps even pride. "You have become very bold," Lord Ashford said at last, tone edged. "I have become tired," Eleanor corrected. "Tired of living at the mercy of your wages and whims. Tired of smoothing over the consequences of choices I did not make. Today, for the first time, the law recognized me as someone whose consent matters. I mean to remember that." Silence descended again, heavy but different, less volatile, more contemplative. Lord Ashford looked away first. His gaze landed on the ledgers piled on his desk, the visible tombstones of his misjudgments. "What will you do, then?" he asked the Duke, a note of grudging practicality entering his voice. "I assume you did not go to such lengths merely to leave her here, an unmarried daughter in a sinking house." Sebastian's eyes flickered briefly to Eleanor, then back to Ashford. First, I will arrange for a discreet but capable steward to examine your estates. There may yet be ways to mitigate your situation, sales that can be made without destroying livelihoods, economies that will not leave your servants destitute. You have mismanaged. That can to some degree be corrected. Lord Ashford bristled. And why would you involve yourself in my finances? Because your ruin would drag down more than just your own house, Sebastian said evenly. It would affect tenants, tradesmen, neighboring lands. Stability matters. And because, his gaze hardened, your ruin would otherwise tempt you, perhaps again, to solve your failures on the backs of your daughters. Ashford flinched. Eleanor almost felt sorry for him. Almost. And as for Lady Eleanor, the Duke continued, turning fully toward her now, I intend to extend an invitation, temporary at first. Her breath caught. An invitation? To Ravencross, he said, my estate in the north. My sister, the Duchess of Wexford, will be visiting for the summer season. She could use companionship and you could use distance. Time to breathe, away from scandal and watchful eyes. Time to decide what you wish your future to hold, without pressure or expectation. Eleanor's heart stuttered. The offer was extraordinary, improper by some standards, yet carefully constructed to preserve her reputation through the presence of his sister as chaperone. Your Grace, she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the generosity of it. You need not answer now, Sebastian said gently. Think on it, but know that the offer stands whenever you wish to accept it. Lord Ashford looked between them, his expression unreadable. Finally he gave a stiff nod. I suppose that would be acceptable. Under the circumstances. It was as close to gratitude as he would likely ever come. 3 months later. The gardens at Ravencross were unlike anything Eleanor had ever known. Where Blackmore Manor's grounds had been formal and constrained, these sprawled with wild beauty, roses climbing stone walls, lavender spilling across pathways, ancient oaks spreading their branches like benedictions over emerald lawns. Eleanor walked those paths now in the golden light of late afternoon, a book tucked under her arm, her hair loosely braided. She wore a simple muslin dress the color of cream, comfortable and unpretentious. No corset laced too tight, no jewels weighing down her throat, no performance required. For the first time in her life, she could simply be. The Duchess of Wexford, Sebastian's sister Catherine, had proven to be warm and wickedly intelligent, with a laugh that rang through the halls and a complete disregard for society's more suffocating conventions. She had taken one look at Eleanor upon her arrival and declared, "Oh good, someone sensible. I was afraid Sebastian would saddle me with some simpering debutante who fainted at the sight of a spider." Eleanor had laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. The weeks had passed in a haze of unexpected peace, long rides through the countryside, afternoons in the vast library, where Eleanor discovered works by authors she'd never been permitted to read. Evenings filled with music and conversation that ranged from politics to philosophy to the best method for training stubborn horses. And through it all, the Duke, Sebastian, as he'd finally insisted she call him when they were private, had been a constant, steady presence. Not hovering, not demanding, simply there. A ride companion who didn't expect empty chatter. A chess opponent who celebrated when she won. A listener who never dismissed her thoughts as frivolous. She had watched him with the estate tenants, had seen the respect in their eyes when he walked among them, had witnessed him spending an entire morning helping repair a widow's roof because her sons were too young and she had no one else. Had heard him laugh with genuine delight when a tenant farmer's daughter presented him with a slightly lopsided crown made of wildflowers. This was the man who had saved her, not because he wanted something from her, but because it was right. There you are. Eleanor turned to find Sebastian approaching across the lawn, still in his riding clothes, his dark hair windswept. Her heart did that strange, fluttering thing it had started doing lately whenever he appeared. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost in the rose maze again," he said with a slight smile. "That was one time," Eleanor protested, laughing, "and your gardener gave extremely confusing directions. He's 73 and half deaf. I'm not sure he heard your question properly." Sebastian fell into step beside her. Walk with me?" They wandered toward the far end of the garden, where a small pond reflected the sky like polished silver. Swans glided across its surface, graceful and serene. "I received word from London today," Sebastian said after a moment. "Richard Thornfield has been formally charged with attempted murder and fraud. The trial will proceed next month." Eleanor absorbed this quietly. She felt less than she'd expected. Not triumph, not even particular satisfaction, just a distant sense of justice finally catching up to a man who had evaded it too long. "And Edmund?" she asked. "Thriving, from what I hear. He's taken to his restored estates with remarkable energy, already implementing reforms, rehiring staff that Richard had dismissed, making amends where he can." Sebastian paused. "He asked after you, wanted to be sure you were well." "That's kind of him." They reached a stone bench overlooking the pond and sat. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its evening song. "Eleanor," Sebastian said quietly, "there's something I need to say to you." Her breath caught. The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken but unmistakable. "When I first learned of your situation," he continued, his gaze fixed on the water, "I told myself I was acting out of duty. A wrong to be righted, a powerful man abusing his position, an innocent in need of protection. All true enough, but not complete." He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes was raw and unguarded. "The truth is, from the moment I saw you at that tribunal, so frightened but so determined not to show it, refusing to be diminished even when the entire world was watching, I was lost. You stood before that chamber and demanded to be seen as a person, not property. You spoke truth when silence would have been safer, and I realized that I had been looking for someone like you my entire life." Eleanor's heart hammered. "Sebastian, I'm not asking for an answer now," he said quickly. "God knows you've had enough of men making demands of you, but I need you to know if you wish it, if you choose it freely, I would count it the greatest honor of my life to stand beside you. Not as a rescuer, not as a protector, but as an equal. A partner." His hand covered hers on the bench, warm and sure. "I know society says you're scandalous now, unmarriageable, damaged goods. Society is populated by fools. You are the bravest person I have ever known, Eleanor Ashford, and I am hopelessly, completely in love with you." The words hung between them, simple and shattering and perfect. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but these were not tears of fear or despair. These were something entirely new. "I thought," she whispered, "that after everything I would never want to marry, that I would spend the rest of my life protecting the freedom I'd fought so hard to gain." Sebastian nodded, his expression carefully neutral, prepared for rejection. "But then I came here," Eleanor continued, "and I discovered something I hadn't expected. Freedom isn't just the absence of chains, it's the presence of choice. And when I imagine my future now, the life I want to build, the person I want to become, you are in every version of it." His breath caught. "So yes," she said, smiling through tears. "Yes, Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Ravencross, hero of battles I'll never fully understand, champion of lost causes, terrible chess player when you're distracted." "I am not a terrible chess player," he protested, laughing. "Yes," she finished, "I choose you. I choose this. I choose us." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "You're certain? Because once I kiss you, Eleanor Ashford, I'm never letting you go." "Promise?" she whispered. His answer was to close the distance between them and kiss her with a tenderness that stole her breath and gave it back transformed. It was not the kiss of possession or conquest. It was the kiss of two people who had fought through darkness and found each other in the light. When they finally broke apart, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and violet. The swans had settled for the night, and the first stars were beginning to appear. "We should go back," Sebastian murmured against her hair. "Catherine will have noticed we're missing and will be insufferably smug about being right." "Right about what?" "She told me 3 weeks ago that I was obviously in love with you and should stop being a coward about it. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free. "Your sister is very wise. Annoyingly so." They walked back toward the house hand in hand, two people who had found in each other not rescue, but recognition, not dependency, but partnership, not an ending to their stories, but a beginning. Behind them, the garden settled into twilight, beautiful and wild and free. Epilogue. 1 year later, the wedding of Lady Eleanor Ashford and Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Ravencross, was not the grand society spectacle that such a union might have warranted. Instead, it took place in the small chapel at Ravencross, attended by family, close friends, and a surprising number of tenants who had come to love their duke's remarkable bride. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, with wildflowers woven through her hair. Thomas stood beside her, proud and protective. Her younger sisters, no longer confined by their father's desperation, chatted excitedly about the wedding breakfast. Even Lord Ashford had come, humbled by the Duke's patient intervention in his finances and by the daughter he had so badly underestimated. He would never be warm, but he had learned, slowly, painfully, that his children were not currency to be spent. Edmund Thornfield attended as well, restored to his rightful place and finding in that restoration a kind of peace. He had taken to visiting Ravencross occasionally, drawn by friendship with Sebastian and a quiet admiration for Eleanor's courage. As Eleanor walked down the aisle toward the man who had given her back her life and then offered to share his own, she felt no fear, no dread, no sense of being trapped or traded or diminished. She felt only joy and the fierce, bright certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. When Sebastian took her hand and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. When she replied with her own, she meant every word with her entire heart. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause and cheers that echoed through the rafters and out into the summer air. They were married, they were free, they were chosen. And their story, not one written for them by duty or desperation, was only just beginning. From the narrator to you, dear listeners. And so we close this chapter of Eleanor and Sebastian's tale, a story of courage in the face of cruelty, of love that honored rather than owned, of choices made freely and futures claimed boldly. If this story moved you, if it made your heart race or brought tears to your eyes or reminded you that even in our darkest moments we have more power than we know, please take just a moment to share that with us. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another tale of love, redemption, and the kind of romance that changes everything. Leave a comment below telling us what you loved most. Was it Eleanor's bravery, Sebastian's steadfast protection, the moment when justice finally prevailed? We read every single comment and treasure hearing from you. Give this video a like if these stories matter to you. If you believe in heroines who refuse to be victims, and heroes who know that true strength means using power to protect, not to control. Your likes tell us to keep bringing you these stories. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release our next epic romance. Because there are so many more stories to tell, tales of forbidden love, second chances, and the kind of passion that defies every obstacle. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for listening. Until next time, dear friends, may you always choose courage, always demand to be seen, and always, always believe that you deserve a love story worthy of you. Until we meet again, stay romantic, stay bold, and stay tuned.